The courtroom was quiet in the way only courtrooms get when a verdict feels already decided. Not silent heavy, like the air itself had chosen a side. At the center of it all sat a black woman in a plain gray suit, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. No trembling, no tears, no visible fear, just stillness. The kind that made people uncomfortable because it didn't beg for sympathy. Across the room, a white police officer stood tall on the witness stand. His badge caught the light every time he moved, polished and proud. His voice was confident, practiced, smooth from years of being believed. He pointed toward her. "She resisted arrest," he said firmly. "She was aggressive. I feared for my safety." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Pens scratched paper. The jury nodded almost instinctively. This was a story they'd heard before, one that always ended the same way. The prosecutor leaned in, satisfied. The judge didn't interrupt. No one questioned why the officer's body camera footage was missing. No one asked why there were no witnesses called. His word was enough. The black woman didn't flinch. She didn't look at the officer. She didn't look at the jury. She looked straight ahead, as if she were watching something only she could see. The officer continued, layering lie upon lie with calm precision. Every sentence pushed her closer to conviction. Every word painted her as dangerous, unstable, guilty. Still, she said nothing. The room read her silence as defeat. The officer allowed himself the smallest smile, the kind that said he'd done this before, that he knew how this ended, that the system would protect him like it always had. Then the judge asked the defense if they had anything to add before moving forward. For the first time, the woman moved. She stood slowly, not rushed, not hesitant. Her chair barely made a sound as she pushed it back. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, clear, and controlled, "I would like permission to present evidence." The officer let out a quiet laugh. The prosecutor frowned. The judge hesitated. No one in that room knew what was about to happen. No one suspected the truth sitting calmly at the defense table. Because what they didn't know, what the officer never imagined, was that this woman wasn't trapped in his lie. She was the reason he was about to lose everything. Her name was Alicia Monroe, and to everyone watching that courtroom, she looked like another name on a docket. Another black woman caught in the slow, grinding gears of a system that rarely paused long enough to ask who she really was. She sat upright beside her attorney, shoulders relaxed, chin level. The kind of posture that didn't come from confidence alone, but from discipline. From training herself never to shrink, even when the world expected her to. Alicia had learned that lesson early. She grew up in a neighborhood where sirens were more common than lullabies, where kids learned to read faces before textbooks, where her father, a quiet, hardworking man, was stopped so often by police that it became routine. Hands on the hood, questions without answers, apologies that never came. Her mother used to say, "Don't give them a reason." But Alicia learned something deeper watching her parents navigate that world. Sometimes, no reason was needed at all. That realization left a mark. It was why Alicia became the woman she was, calm under pressure, observant, patient. She learned how systems worked not by trusting them, but by studying them, learning their habits, their blind spots, their arrogance. Across the courtroom sat the man who represented everything that had shaped her resolve. Officer Daniel Rourke. To the public, he was a model cop. Commendations framed his career. Community photos showed him shaking hands, smiling for cameras, standing in front of squad cars with schoolchildren gathered around his legs. His reputation carried weight, enough to silence questions before they were ever asked. But beneath that reputation was a different story. In certain neighborhoods, his name was spoken carefully, not loudly, not officially. Complaints followed him like shadows, excessive force, intimidation, threats made where no one could hear them clearly enough to prove. Reports that went missing, statements rewritten, internal investigations that quietly dissolved. Rourke knew how to operate inside the gray areas. He knew which lines could be bent without breaking. And most of all, he knew that his badge carried a power that few dared to challenge. Certainly not someone like Alicia. At least that's what he believed. The arrest itself had seemed small on paper. A traffic stop late at night, a vague description, a failure to comply. Words chosen carefully to sound reasonable, familiar. To the system, it was routine. To Alicia, it was something else entirely. Because when those lights flashed behind her car, she wasn't afraid, she was alert. Every movement calculated, every word measured. She knew the risks of existing in that moment, in that body, in that space. What no one else knew was that Alicia hadn't ended up there by accident. She was there because the truth had a pattern. And patterns, once studied long enough, led somewhere. Her attorney, Michael Reyes, sat beside her, flipping nervously through his notes. He was good at his job, passionate, prepared, but even he couldn't hide the worry etched into his face. He had seen cases like this collapse under the weight of a single badge. He leaned toward her more than once, whispering warnings. The evidence wasn't strong enough. The judge wasn't sympathetic. The officer's record carried influence. This could go bad, he murmured quietly. Alicia nodded, acknowledging him, but not agreeing. Because she wasn't here to hope for justice. She was here to expose something. The courtroom itself felt like a character in the story, wood-paneled walls polished by decades of decisions, portraits of former judges staring down like silent witnesses to history repeating itself. The jury box held 12 strangers, each carrying their own assumptions, their own fears, their own learned instincts. And hovering over everything was the unspoken social tension, the one no one named, but everyone felt. A black woman accused. A white officer testifying. A system trained to choose which voice sounded more believable. Officer Rourke understood that tension instinctively. He leaned into it. His posture was relaxed. His answers were confident. He spoke the language the courtroom trusted. Alicia spoke very little. Not because she didn't have a voice, but because she knew when silence was power. Inside her bag rested a sealed folder. No labels, no markings, just weight, not physical, moral. It was the kind of weight that came from knowing the truth and waiting for the right moment to let it breathe. She glanced once at the clock mounted above the judge's bench. Time mattered. Every second that passed allowed the lie to settle deeper. But it also brought her closer to the moment when the lie would collapse under its own certainty. Alicia wasn't angry. She wasn't desperate. She was prepared. Because this wasn't just about her arrest. It was about every name that never made it into a courtroom. Every voice dismissed before it finished speaking. Every truth buried under procedure and authority. And whether this system realized it yet or not, it wasn't just putting her on trial. It was about to be tested itself. The night Alicia Monroe was arrested didn't begin with chaos. It began with quiet. A steady hum of tires against wet asphalt. Streetlights blurring into long, golden streaks across her windshield. The city breathing softly around her, unaware that it was about to witness another story it would never fully hear. Alicia drove with both hands on the wheel, posture relaxed, eyes alert. She wasn't tired. She wasn't distracted. She had learned long ago that awareness was a form of survival. The red and blue lights appeared suddenly in her rearview mirror. She didn't flinch. She checked her speed, legal. Turn signal on. She pulled over smoothly, stopping beneath a flickering street lamp that buzzed faintly above her car. Alicia took a slow breath. This moment, this exact moment, had played out countless times in her life in different forms. Sometimes with her father, sometimes with friends, sometimes in stories that ended much worse than this one ever should. She rolled down her window halfway and placed her hands clearly on the steering wheel. Footsteps approached, heavy, deliberate. Officer Daniel Rourke stopped just behind her window, his shadow stretching across the interior of her car like a warning. He didn't greet her, didn't introduce himself, didn't explain why she'd been stopped. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, peering inside her vehicle as if searching for a reason. "License and registration," he said. His tone wasn't aggressive. It didn't need to be. It carried the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. Alicia complied calmly, reaching slowly, narrating her movements exactly as she'd been taught. "Officer," she said evenly, "may I ask why I was pulled over?" The question landed wrong. Rourke's jaw tightened just enough for her to notice. His eyes lingered on her face longer than necessary, scanning not for threat, but for attitude. "You match the description of a suspect," he replied. Alicia paused. What suspect? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he straightened, resting a hand casually on his belt. Step out of the vehicle. Her heartbeat remained steady, but her mind sharpened. This was the pivot point, the moment where things could either remain procedural or slide into something else entirely. Officer, she said, still calm, I haven't done anything wrong. I'd like to understand. Step out of the vehicle. The repetition carried weight now, not policy power. Alicia obeyed. The pavement was cold beneath her shoes. Rain misted the air lightly, clinging to her coat, her hair, the edges of her vision. Somewhere nearby, a car passed without slowing. Rourke circled her once, slow, deliberate. His flashlight cut across her body, pausing in places that made his intention clear. Hands where I can see them, he ordered. They already were. You got anything on you I should know about? He asked. No, she replied. You sure about that? His voice dipped, edged with something that wasn't concern. Alicia met his gaze briefly, not challenging, not submissive. Neutral, controlled. Yes. That look, that calm refusal to be intimidated, irritated him more than any argument could have. He stepped closer. Turn around. She did. The cuffs came out faster than protocol required, metal biting into her wrists with unnecessary force. Officer, Alicia said evenly, I'm not resisting. He tightened them anyway. That's not what I'm writing, he muttered. Those words landed harder than the cuffs. Not what I'm doing. What I'm writing. That was when Alicia understood, not feared, not guessed, but understood that this moment was about narrative, about who would be believed once the story was told. Rourke guided her toward his patrol car, his grip firm, possessive. A neighbor's porch light flicked on across the street. Someone watched from behind a curtain. No one came outside. At the station, the air felt stale, recycled, heavy with history. Alicia was processed quickly, efficiently. Fingerprints taken, property logged, her questions met with silence or sarcasm. When she was finally seated in a holding area, Rourke leaned casually against the doorway, jotting notes onto a clipboard. You know, he said without looking up, things go a lot smoother when people cooperate. Alicia tilted her head slightly. I did cooperate. He smiled thinly. That's not how it looked to me. She studied his face now, not as a victim, but as an observer, the small twitch in his cheek, the confidence, the certainty that his version would be the only one that mattered. What did I do, she asked, that justified this? He looked up then, met her eyes directly. You made me uncomfortable, he said. It wasn't an answer. It was a confession, though he didn't realize it. Hours later, paperwork signed, charges filed, Alicia was released pending trial. The night air outside the station felt colder than before. She stood there alone for a moment, rain finally stopping, city lights blinking as if nothing had happened. But something had. Because when Rourke wrote his report that night, he didn't just stretch the truth. He rewrote reality. He claimed Alicia had been evasive, that she refused commands, that she moved aggressively, that he feared for his safety. Each sentence stacked neatly on the last, building a version of events that painted him as reasonable and her as a threat. And when the case reached the courtroom weeks later, that version was treated not as one perspective, but as fact. Now back in the present, Rourke sat confidently on the witness stand, repeating that same story under oath. Alicia listened carefully. Every lie he told was familiar, not because she'd heard it before, but because she had anticipated it. He described her hostile tone, her sudden movements, her refusal to comply. Each word was chosen to sound measured, credible, professional. The jury watched him closely. Some nodded, some frowned, some avoided looking at Alicia entirely. Her attorney objected once, twice, each time overruled. The prosecutor guided Rourke smoothly, letting him expand on his account, letting the narrative settle deeper into the room. Alicia felt the weight of the moment pressing in, not fear, but gravity. This was the crossroads. If nothing disrupted this story now, it would harden into truth. The judge glanced down at her file, then back up. Officer Rourke, he said, you're certain of your testimony. Rourke didn't hesitate. Absolutely, Your Honor. The certainty in his voice was almost impressive. Almost. Alicia looked down briefly at her hands, calm, steady, unmarked. Then she looked at the clock again. Not much longer now. Because the confrontation that truly mattered wasn't the one on the street. It was the one unfolding here, in a room where lies wore suits, and truth had learned to wait patiently for its turn to speak. The judge's pen hovered above the bench, suspended between patience and impatience. He glanced from the officer to the defense table, then back again, as if weighing not evidence but instinct. Courtrooms were built on instinct as much as law, and instinct had been trained for decades to lean a certain way. Officer Rourke remained composed. His shoulders were loose. His hands rested comfortably on the rail of the witness stand. This was familiar ground. He had testified before. He knew how to pace his words, how to sound reasonable, how to let silence make his point for him. Alicia felt the room turning against her inch by inch. The prosecutor stepped closer to the stand, voice calm, almost sympathetic. He asked Rourke to explain what he felt in that moment on the street. Not what he saw, not what he did, what he felt. Rourke seized the opening. "I felt threatened," he said. "I've been on the force long enough to know when a situation can turn dangerous." Dangerous, the word floated through the courtroom and settled where it always did. The jury absorbed it quietly. Fear was persuasive when wrapped in authority. Alicia's attorney shifted in his seat. He rose slowly, requesting permission to cross-examine. The judge allowed it, though his tone suggested limits. The questions began carefully. Timeline, distance, lighting, where exactly Rourke had been standing, where Alicia's hands had been. Each answer sounded consistent enough on its own. But Alicia noticed something else. Every time the attorney asked about specifics, Rourke generalized. When pressed for detail, he returned to emotion, to feeling, to instinct. It was subtle, almost clever. Then came the question about the report. "Officer," the attorney asked, "you wrote that Ms. Monroe refused to comply with verbal commands. Can you specify which commands?" Rourke paused, just a beat too long. "I instructed her to exit the vehicle," he said, "multiple times." "And she did exit the vehicle, correct?" "Yes," Rourke replied. "So she complied with that command." Rourke's jaw tightened. "Eventually." The attorney nodded, writing something down. The jury watched closely now. A crack, small but visible, had formed. Still, the momentum favored the badge. The prosecutor objected to the line of questioning, arguing semantics. The judge sustained it. The moment passed. Alicia exhaled quietly through her nose. This was how it happened. Not through one big lie, but through 1,000 protected ones. The prosecutor resumed, steering the narrative back to safety, back to authority. He asked Rourke about his service record. Commendations, years on the force, training certifications. Each answer reinforced the image the system preferred. Then came the photographs. Still images pulled from traffic cameras nearby, grainy, inconclusive. The prosecution framed them as corroboration. The defense objected, overruled. Alicia studied the images carefully. She already knew what they would show. Nothing. And nothing, when presented with confidence, often became everything. As the exhibits were discussed, Alicia felt the familiar pressure of invisibility. The sense that her presence in the room was symbolic rather than human. She was an object being debated, not a person being heard. Her attorney leaned toward her again, whispering urgently. The jury wasn't responding. The judge seemed impatient. If they didn't pivot soon, the narrative would lock. Alicia nodded once. She reached into her bag slowly, deliberately, careful not to draw attention. Her fingers brushed the edge of the sealed folder. It was heavier than paper had any right to be. The judge called for a brief pause, allowing the court to reset before proceeding. Rourke stepped down from the stand, casting a quick glance toward Alicia. There was no concern in his eyes, only certainty. That certainty had protected him for years. The pause ended, proceedings resumed. The prosecutor announced they would rest their case after one final clarification. Rourke was recalled briefly to affirm his statements. He did so confidently, swearing again that his account was accurate and complete. The judge turned toward the defense. "Counsel," he said, "do you intend to call your client to testify?" The room tightened. Alicia's attorney hesitated. This was the moment every defense lawyer feared. Putting a black woman on the stand against a decorated officer carried risk. One wrong word, one misinterpreted tone. He looked at Alicia, searching her face for doubt. He found none. Yes, the attorney said finally. The defense calls Ms. Alicia Monroe. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Alicia stood. As she walked toward the stand, she felt every eye track her movement. The weight of assumption, the hunger for confirmation of stereotype. She climbed the steps and took her seat, adjusting the microphone with practiced ease. She was sworn in. The first questions were predictable. Name, occupation, residence, her answers were measured, unremarkable. Then the prosecutor began his cross-examination. Ms. Monroe, he said, isn't it true that you questioned the officer's authority during the stop? I asked why I was being detained, Alicia replied. So you challenged him? I asked a question. The prosecutor pressed. You didn't immediately comply with every command, did you? I complied with lawful instructions, she said calmly. A murmur stirred. The judge raised a hand for silence. The prosecutor leaned forward. And yet you expect this court to believe that an experienced officer fabricated his entire report. Alicia didn't answer immediately. She looked at the jury, at the judge, then finally at Officer Rourke. I expect this court, she said evenly, to examine the facts, not the uniform. The prosecutor scoffed. That sounds rehearsed. It sounds accurate, Alicia replied. The judge intervened, cautioning her to answer questions directly. Alicia nodded respectfully. But something had shifted. Her voice hadn't cracked. Her posture hadn't shrunk. She hadn't performed fear or anger. She had performed certainty. And certainty, when it came from someone the system expected to fold, unsettled the room. The prosecutor moved on, attempting to provoke a reaction, asking about her background, her education, her reasons for being in that neighborhood. Each question circled closer to something unspoken. Finally, he asked, Ms. Monroe, do you have any evidence to support your claims? Alicia met his gaze. Yes, she said. The word landed heavier than expected. Her attorney stood immediately. Your Honor, he said, the defense requests permission to submit additional evidence. The judge frowned. This should have been disclosed earlier. Alicia spoke before her attorney could respond. With respect, Your Honor, she said, the timing is intentional. The courtroom froze. Rourke shifted in his seat for the first time. The judge studied her carefully now, seeing her not as a defendant but as something unfamiliar. Proceed, he said slowly. Alicia reached into her bag and placed the sealed folder on the stand. No one spoke as the folder rested there untouched like a held breath. The judge stared at it. The prosecutor hesitated. Rourke's confidence thinned just enough to notice. Alicia's hands were steady. Whatever came next would no longer belong to rumor or assumption. It would belong to record, consequence, and a truth that refused to remain quiet. The court had crossed a line it could never uncross again. The sealed folder sat between Alicia Monroe and the court like an unanswered question no one wanted to ask out loud. It wasn't marked. No letterhead. No seal visible to the room. Just thick, manila paper resting calmly on polished wood, daring someone to acknowledge it. The judge leaned forward slightly. His eyes flicked to the prosecutor, then to the defense, then briefly to Officer Daniel Rourke. What is this? The judge asked. Alicia didn't rush to answer. She understood something most people didn't. Timing mattered as much as truth. She let the silence stretch just long enough for discomfort to bloom. Evidence, she said simply. The prosecutor stood immediately. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defense had ample time to disclose. The defense didn't know it existed, Alicia said calmly. That stopped him. The judge raised a hand. Ms. Monroe, he said, you will address the court through counsel. Alicia nodded once. Her attorney rose, clearly uneasy but trusting her. Your Honor, he said carefully, my client is requesting that the court admit materials that directly contradict the testimony given under oath moments ago. Rourke shifted again, a small movement, almost nothing, but Alicia saw it. The confidence he'd worn like armor was thinning strand by strand. The judge exhaled slowly. On what grounds was this evidence withheld until now? Alicia spoke before her attorney could answer. Because, she said evenly, had it been introduced earlier, it would have disappeared. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor scoffed. That's an accusation without proof. Alicia met his gaze. It's an observation with experience. The judge studied her face longer now, not impatient, not dismissive, curious. Explain, he said. Alicia folded her hands together, steady. The officer testified that his body camera malfunctioned, that no footage exists of the stop, that there were no corroborating witnesses, that his report was the only reliable account. Rourke stared straight ahead. What he didn't mention, Alicia continued, is that his body camera was functioning before and after the stop. Nor did he mention that multiple internal system logs contradict the timing in his report. The prosecutor shook his head. Your Honor, this is speculation. It's documentation, Alicia replied. The judge paused, then nodded toward the bailiff. Bring the folder. The bailiff approached the stand, lifted the folder carefully, and placed it before the judge. He opened it slowly, flipping through the contents with measured attention. The courtroom watched his face. Whatever he was reading, it was shifting something. The judge looked up. These are federal records. Yes, Alicia said. The word landed like a quiet thunderclap. The prosecutor's face tightened. Federal records pertaining to what exactly? Alicia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at Officer Rourke. Pertaining to him. The room reacted this time. Whispers broke containment. The judge struck the gavel once, restoring order, but the damage was done. The certainty that had once filled the space was gone. Ms. Monroe, the judge said carefully, are you asserting that this officer is under federal investigation? Alicia nodded. I'm stating it. Rourke stood abruptly. That's a lie, he said, his voice louder than it had been all day. I don't know what game she's playing, but this is outrageous. The judge fixed him with a hard look. Officer, sit down. Rourke hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long, before complying. Alicia felt the shift fully now. The room no longer belonged to him. Her attorney swallowed, then spoke. Your Honor, the defense requests that the court review the contents of that folder in full. It includes authenticated logs, internal timestamps, and corroborated documentation. The prosecutor protested again, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. He was no longer steering the narrative. He was chasing it. The judge flipped another page, then another, his brow furrowed. These documents suggest, he said slowly, that Officer Rourke accessed his body camera system manually after the arrest. Rourke's mouth opened, then closed. And that footage was deleted, the judge continued, outside standard protocol. A heavy silence fell. The prosecutor cleared his throat. Your Honor, even if that were true, it doesn't. It suggests misconduct, the judge interrupted, and possibly perjury. That word changed everything. Alicia remained still, but inside she felt the quiet release of something long held. Not satisfaction, not victory, relief that the truth had finally been allowed to breathe. The judge leaned back. Ms. Monroe, he said, where did you obtain this information? Alicia took a breath. This was the moment she'd prepared for. I obtained it, she said, in the course of my duties. The prosecutor laughed sharply. Duties as what? Alicia met his eyes. As a federal agent. The courtroom erupted. The judge struck the gavel again, harder this time. Order. Officer Rourke's face drained of color. Ms. Monroe, the judge said, voice tight, you are telling this court that you are an FBI agent, Alicia said, assigned to an internal corruption task force. Her attorney looked stunned. He hadn't known, no one in the room had. The prosecutor stammered. This is impossible, there's no record. Because my assignment was undercover, Alicia said calmly, and Officer Rourke was a subject of that investigation. The judge stared at her, then at the folder, then at Rourke. How long? He asked quietly. 18 months, Alicia replied, during which time Officer Rourke demonstrated a consistent pattern of falsified reports, excessive force complaints, and targeted stops that disproportionately affected black residents. Rourke shot to his feet again. This is a setup. "Sit down," the judge barked. Rourke complied, shaking now. Alicia continued. "The night of my arrest was not an accident. It was the final confirmation of a pattern already documented. I allowed the arrest to proceed because truth requires exposure." The prosecutor's voice dropped. "You allowed yourself to be arrested." "Yes." The courtroom absorbed that. Alicia's voice softened, but her words sharpened. "Because too many people don't survive encounters like that. Too many stories never make it here." The judge closed the folder. "We will recess," he said firmly. "Immediately." As people stood, confusion buzzing like static, Alicia remained seated, composed. Officer Rourke was escorted out, not as an officer, but as a man suddenly stripped of certainty. This was no longer a simple case. It was a reckoning. And the truth, once unleashed, was only beginning to tighten its grip. The courtroom did not feel like a courtroom anymore. It felt like a room where gravity had shifted and no one yet knew which way was down. People stood but did not move. Conversations started and died in the same breath. The judge exited through the side door without another glance, leaving behind a silence louder than any argument that had filled the room before. Alicia remained seated. She did not follow the crowd's instinct to rise, to whisper, to react. She had learned that stillness unsettled people more than confrontation. Around her, attorneys gathered papers they no longer understood the value of. Jurors avoided eye contact, suddenly aware that they had been standing on the edge of something far larger than one woman's arrest. Officer Daniel Rourke was escorted out by court security, not in handcuffs, not yet, but without the casual authority he had entered with. His shoulders were stiff. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. He did not look at Alicia as he passed her. He could not afford to. Because looking at her would have meant acknowledging that the narrative he had controlled for years was collapsing in real time. In a side conference room, the prosecutor paced. His tie was loosened now, jacket off, the performance of certainty abandoned. He flipped through his legal pad again and again, as if the right argument might materialize if he stared long enough. "This wasn't disclosed," he muttered. "This was manipulated. There are rules." Across the hall, Alicia sat with her attorney, Michael Reyes, who finally broke the silence. "You're FBI," he said quietly, disbelief threaded through every word. "Yes," Alicia replied. "And you didn't think to mention that?" "I couldn't," she said, "not until now." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "You let me walk into this blind." "I let you do your job," Alicia said gently, "and you did it well." Michael studied her face, searching for arrogance, for deception, for something that might justify his frustration. He found none, only calm, only resolve. "This could have gone very differently," he said. "Yes," Alicia replied, "that's why it mattered." The recess stretched longer than expected. Phones buzzed in pockets. Text messages were sent that would never be unsent. Somewhere outside the courthouse, reporters had already begun to gather, drawn by whispers and half-leaked truths. When the judge returned, the room snapped back to attention with forced discipline. He looked older now. The weight of responsibility sat visibly heavier on his shoulders. "Be seated," he said. Everyone complied. The judge addressed the court slowly, deliberately. "This proceeding has taken a turn that requires immediate clarification. I am suspending the current trajectory of this trial pending verification of newly presented federal documentation." The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, the state objects to." "Your objection is noted," the judge said sharply, and overruled. That word landed with finality. He turned toward Alicia. "Ms. Monroe, if your assertions are accurate, this court has been used as a stage for misconduct that extends beyond its jurisdiction." "They are accurate," Alicia said. "Then you understand," the judge continued, "that this court must now proceed with caution." Alicia nodded. "I understand." The judge looked toward the gallery. "I am ordering this courtroom cleared of all non-essential personnel." The room erupted again, but this time it was controlled. Deputies guided spectators out. Jurors were dismissed for the day, instructed not to discuss what they had witnessed. The press was held back, frustration buzzing just beyond the doors. When the room finally settled, only the judge, the attorneys, Alicia, and Officer Rourke remained. The judge turned to Rourke. Officer, you testified under oath today. You understand the seriousness of that. Rourke swallowed. Yes, Your Honor. You also understand, the judge continued, that perjury is not protected by rank or reputation. Rourke nodded stiffly. Do you wish to amend your testimony? The question hung in the air. This was the moment Alicia had anticipated, not because she needed it, but because she wanted to see whether he would take it. Rourke's eyes flicked briefly to the prosecutor, then to Alicia. For the first time, uncertainty crept into his expression. No, he said, I stand by my statement. Alicia exhaled quietly, not disappointment, confirmation. The judge's jaw tightened. Very well. He turned to the prosecutor. I am referring this matter to federal authorities effective immediately. The prosecutor's shoulders slumped slightly, relief and dread colliding. The judge continued. Officer Rourke, you are ordered to surrender your badge and service weapon pending investigation. Rourke stiffened. Your Honor. Now the judge said. Court security stepped forward. The badge came off first. The metallic click echoed louder than it should have. The weapon followed, handled carefully, professionally. Rourke stood there afterward, hands empty, identity stripped down to flesh and consequence. Alicia watched him not with satisfaction, but with clarity. This was not vengeance. This was balance. The judge addressed Alicia again. Ms. Monroe, the charges against you are dismissed effective immediately. He paused, then added, with the court's formal apology. Alicia inclined her head. Thank you, Your Honor. The words were polite, but they carried weight, not forgiveness, recognition. As the session concluded, Alicia gathered her things calmly. There were no cheers, no dramatic release, just a quiet shift in the air like something toxic had been aired out at last. Outside, the hallway buzzed. Federal agents moved with purpose, credentials flashed, doors closed. Rourke was escorted down a different corridor than the one he had entered from. Michael walked beside Alicia as they exited the courtroom. They're going to come after you for this, he said quietly. They already were, Alicia replied. Outside the courthouse, cameras clicked, questions shouted, names mispronounced. Alicia didn't stop, she didn't look back. She stepped into the daylight knowing that the rising action of this story wasn't about spectacle. It was about pressure. Pressure that had been building for years. Pressure that finally had somewhere to go. And now that it had been released, nothing and no one involved would ever return to the way things were before. The courthouse felt smaller as the day wore on, as if the walls themselves were inching closer, trying to contain what had been unleashed inside them. What began as a routine case had now become something volatile, something alive. Truth has that effect when it's been caged too long. By late afternoon, the federal presence was no longer subtle. Agents moved through the building with quiet authority, their demeanor calm but unmistakably serious. Credentials were checked, doors were closed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when unfamiliar shoes echoed down the hall. This was no longer just a county courthouse matter. The system had called in its own mirror. Alicia Monroe sat alone in a small conference room, hands resting loosely in her lap. The adrenaline had passed. What remained was focus. She had trained herself for moments like this, the point where everything she'd carried silently finally demanded to be spoken aloud, documented, recorded, and judged. An agent stepped in briefly, nodding to her. We're ready when you are. She nodded back. In another room, Officer Daniel Rourke sat across from two federal investigators. The chair felt different without a badge weighing down his chest, without a gun at his hip, without the unspoken assumption that he was in control. They hadn't raised their voices. They didn't need to. They laid out timelines, call logs, internal memos, complaints that had been buried, reopened, then buried again. Each document stripped away another layer of the identity Rourke had relied on for protection. This isn't about one arrest, one investigator said calmly. It never was. Rourke said nothing. Back in the main courtroom, the judge reconvened the session under sealed conditions. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Everyone present understood this was no longer procedural. This was historic, not because of spectacle, but because of consequence. Alicia was called forward again. She stood at the center of the room, not elevated, not spotlighted, just present, the way she had always been. the way she had learned to be in spaces that expected her to justify her existence. The judge addressed the record carefully. He spoke not only to those present, but to the future, to anyone who might one day read these transcripts and wonder how long the truth had waited. "Ms. Monroe," he said, "this court recognizes your status and the gravity of what you've presented. However, there are serious implications to how this was handled." Alicia nodded. "I understand, Your Honor." "You placed yourself in harm's way," he continued. "You allowed an arrest to proceed. You allowed false testimony to be delivered before revealing your role." "Yes," Alicia said, "because that is how the system reveals itself." The judge leaned back slightly. "Explain." Alicia took a breath. This was the heart of it. "For years," she began, "complaints against Officer Rourke were treated as isolated incidents. Each one dismissed on its own. Each one explained away by circumstance. The pattern was never examined because the narrative was always controlled." She paused, letting the room catch up. "By allowing the arrest to happen," she continued, "by allowing the lie to be told under oath, we documented not just misconduct, but certainty. The certainty that the system would protect him. That certainty is evidence." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. The judge nodded slowly, and today that certainty failed. "Yes," Alicia said. "That was the moment. Not when the badge was surrendered. Not when the charges were dismissed. But when the system was forced to admit out loud that it had been wrong." The federal investigators entered the courtroom next, presenting their preliminary findings on record. Their language was clinical, precise, but the implications were devastating. Officer Rourke was formally charged with perjury, evidence tampering, civil rights violations, abuse of authority. Each charge stacked atop the last, a tower built from years of unchecked power. When Rourke was brought back into the room, the change in him was unmistakable. His posture had collapsed inward. His eyes darted now, searching for allies that no longer existed. The judge looked at him directly. "Officer Rourke," he said, "you were entrusted with authority. That trust has been breached." Rourke's voice cracked for the first time. "I was doing my job." Alicia watched him carefully. "No," she said quietly. "You were doing what you thought you'd never be punished for." The room stilled. Rourke turned toward her, anger flaring through fear. "You set me up." Alicia met his gaze without blinking. "You told the truth would never catch you." That was the line. The one that broke him. His shoulders sagged. His mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time, he looked less like an officer and more like a man confronting the wreckage of his own certainty. The judge ordered him, remanded pending federal proceedings. As deputies moved in, Rourke didn't resist. He didn't fight. He simply stood there as handcuffs closed around wrists that had cuffed so many others without thought. The metallic sound echoed. Alicia felt it in her chest, not as triumph but as finality. The judge addressed the court one last time. "This case stands as a reminder that authority without accountability is not justice. It is risk." He looked at Alicia. "Ms. Monroe, you may step down." She did. As she walked away from the stand, the room watched her differently now. Not as a defendant, not as a symbol, but as an agent of consequence. Outside, as Rourke was escorted down the courthouse steps in full view of the cameras, the story finally broke open. Questions flew, microphones crowded, the narrative fractured and reformed in real time. But Alicia did not step into the spotlight. She stood back, watching quietly as the truth spoke for itself. Because the climax of this story was never about exposure alone. It was about accountability. And once accountability enters the room, nothing stays hidden for long. The courthouse emptied slowly, not with the rush of relief that followed dismissed charges, but with the cautious movement of people who knew they had witnessed something that would echo far beyond the building's walls. The air outside felt different, not lighter, clearer, like a storm had finally moved through, leaving behind broken branches and exposed ground where things could no longer hide. Alicia Monroe stepped down the courthouse stairs without pause. Cameras flashed. Voices called her name, some mispronouncing it, others attaching titles she hadn't used in years. Agent, whistleblower, hero. None of them fit comfortably. She didn't stop. A black sedan waited at the curb. An agent opened the door, nodding once in quiet respect. Alicia slid inside, closing the door behind her, sealing off the noise. For the first time all day, she allowed herself to lean back against the seat. Her reflection stared back at her from the tinted window, composed, unreadable, steady. But beneath that calm, something was loosening. Not relief exactly. Release. Months of preparation, years of restraint, a lifetime of knowing how easily truth could be buried if no one forced it into the light. The car pulled away. Inside federal offices across the city, the consequences began unfolding almost immediately. Files were reopened. Internal memos resurfaced. Names that had once been shielded by procedure were now highlighted in bold. Officer Daniel Rourke was no longer an exception, he was an entry point. Investigators traced patterns Alicia had documented long before the arrest. Traffic stops that escalated without cause. Reports that mirrored one another too closely to be coincidence. Complaints dismissed not because they lacked merit, but because they challenged comfort. Supervisors were questioned. Silence was no longer enough. Within days, Rourke's face appeared on screens across the city, not in uniform, not smiling, but escorted, head lowered, surrounded by questions he could no longer deflect. His lawyer spoke for him now, carefully, defensively, the language of someone no longer protected by certainty. The department released a statement, carefully worded, regret without admission, commitment to review, promises that sounded familiar to communities who had heard them before. But this time, something was different. Because there was a record. Because the lie had been told under oath. Because the truth had been preserved before it could be erased. Michael Reyes stood alone in his office that evening, the city glowing through his window. He replayed the day again and again in his mind. Every objection, every moment he'd nearly lost the thread, every time he'd looked at Alicia and underestimated the depth of what she carried. He realized now that he had defended hundreds of clients. But rarely had he seen someone walk into a courtroom knowing exactly how it would try to break them and refusing to let it. He drafted a letter that night, not to a client, not to a court. To himself, a reminder of why he had become a lawyer in the first place. In neighborhoods where Officer Rourke's name had once been spoken in lowered voices, people talked more openly now. Stories surfaced, not all dramatic, not all headline-worthy, but real. Ordinary moments of fear, of humiliation, of being treated like a problem instead of a person. Some people felt vindicated. Some felt grief for what had been taken from them long before anyone listened. Some felt both. Alicia returned to her apartment late that night. The place was quiet, familiar, grounding. She set her bag down by the door and stood there for a long moment without moving. She thought of her parents, of her father's silence after each stop, of her mother's careful instructions, of all the ways she had learned to survive long before she learned to investigate. She poured herself a glass of water and stood by the window, watching the city pulse below. Somewhere out there, someone was being stopped right now. Somewhere else, someone was deciding whether to speak up or stay quiet. Alicia knew this case would not fix everything. It would not dismantle the system. It would not erase generations of harm. It would not bring back the time lost to fear. But it would disrupt certainty. And disruption was how change began. In the weeks that followed, the department announced internal reforms. Body camera policies were revised. Oversight committees expanded. Public meetings were scheduled. Some changes were cosmetic. Others were real. Alicia understood the difference. She testified again, this time behind closed doors. Not as a defendant, not as a spectacle, but as a professional doing the work she had trained for. She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize the harm. She spoke plainly. Facts had weight when allowed to stand on their own. Officer Rourke was indicted on multiple counts. His defense leaned heavily on procedure, on ambiguity, on the hope that time would dull outrage. But time did not dull this one. Because the record existed. Because Alicia had anticipated every attempt to erase it. On the day charges were formally announced, Alicia was not present. She was already assigned to another case. Another city. Another quiet pattern waiting to be exposed. That was how the work continued. Not with applause, not with closure, but with persistence. One evening, as Alicia packed for her next assignment, she found herself pausing in front of the mirror, not to check her appearance, but to look at herself. She saw someone who had carried the weight of knowing how easily truth could be bent. Someone who had stepped into danger without expecting gratitude. Someone who had learned that justice rarely arrives cleanly, but it arrives when forced to. She allowed herself a small breath, not a smile, just acknowledgement. What happened in that courtroom would follow her, in whispers, in footnotes, in cases where officers hesitated before writing what they couldn't prove. That was enough, because resolution was never about endings. It was about momentum, and momentum, once set in motion, carried far beyond any single room, badge, or lie. This story was never just about one officer or one courtroom. It was about power, and what happens when power assumes it will never be questioned. For generations, too many people have learned that truth alone is not always enough, that the system often decides who sounds believable before a word is spoken. That silence is safer than speaking, and survival sometimes means swallowing injustice whole. But this story reminds us of something deeper. Truth does not disappear just because it's ignored. It waits, it studies, and when it finally stands up, it does not need to shout. Alicia Monroe didn't win because she was louder. She didn't win because she was angry. She didn't win because the system suddenly became kind. She won because she was prepared, because she understood that dignity is not weakness. That patience can be strategy. That justice, when forced into the light with evidence and courage, can shake even the strongest lies. Officer Rourke believed his badge made him untouchable. He believed the courtroom would protect him. He believed the story would end the way it always had. What he didn't understand is that systems don't collapse from chaos, they collapse from exposure. This story is a reminder to those who feel unseen, unheard, underestimated. Your truth matters, even when the world acts like it doesn't. Especially then. And it's also a warning to those who hide behind authority. Power without accountability is temporary. Certainty built on lies always expires. Justice doesn't always arrive quickly. It doesn't always arrive kindly. But when it arrives prepared, it arrives permanently. So if this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it with someone who's been told their voice doesn't matter. With someone who's learned to stay quiet just to stay safe. With someone who needs to remember that truth, real truth, still has weight. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let a lie be the last word.